hundreds. While there's obviously hundreds of plants that will grow here in the Santa Clarita Valley, uh, these 30 were selected based on their water requirements. They have to be low to medium water requirements. Their availability. Some plants aren't available all year round, and they have to have been successful here in the SCV. So a nursery inventory will vary throughout the year. And simply because these plants are on our list here, it does not mean that we are guaranteeing that this plant will succeed under your care. Plants can be overwatered and underwatered. There can also be microclimates in your yard. So a plant may thrive in one section of your yard and do very poorly in another. And this could have to do with the amount of shade. The drainage in the yard is very important. If you have very hard soil and the water doesn't drain, it can be difficult to grow some plants. And then, of course, if you don't plant it correctly the day you plant it, if you don't maintain it correctly, then no plant is going to be terribly happy. So we're going to start with trees. So during this presentation, we'll talk about trees, ground covers, shrubs, and perennials. So our first tree is a beautiful one, the Chinese pistache. It's one of the few trees that we can count on here in the Santa Clarita Valley to get us some fall color. It's a fairly large tree. I would put it medium to upper medium size, but doesn't necessarily have the aggressive root system of large trees. So this one is nice. It'll give you a nice spread, 30 to 40 feet. And it is deciduous. What that means is that it will drop its leaves in the winter and allow the sunlight to come through during the winter. Here's a beautiful picture of one. Kind of gives you the idea of shape. Nice round-headed. And yeah, just a beautiful tree. The next tree is the holly leaf oak. It's not a native oak, but this particular species is native to the Mediterranean region. It might be a little easier to grow than our native varieties. It doesn't seem to be as susceptible to the diseases that our native varieties are susceptible to. It'll also tolerate most of our soils out here, and it can survive with, I've seen them growing in lawn areas, and I've seen them growing in a drought-tolerant situation. So very versatile. It is evergreen and grows rather quickly. There's that one there is actually in a park. You can see there's lawn around it. You can see the nice round head there. So that's the holly leaf oak, a beautiful tree. And I've seen it growing from the ocean to the desert. So excellent, excellent tree for most locations. The third tree is the Japanese blueberry tree. Once again, evergreen. It does get a little taller than wide. Drought tolerant. If you want to see examples of this tree up at the Water District Conservation Garden, this is the tree that is growing in the parking lot. And it's not some areas of the parking lot are obviously not irrigated. And a few years ago, when we had our last drought, the trees that didn't get any irrigation, they didn't die. They didn't look fantastic, but once they got some rain, they perked right up. And there is a picture of the parking lot at the Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency garden right there. And you can see that a large section of the root system is underneath the driveway there. The driveway or parking lot is made of permeable materials, permeable blocks. So the rain, when it does come, which isn't very often, can percolate down in between the bricks there. And this would be an example of a tree that most of its root system is not getting any water during the summer. And I suppose if I was to drive up there right now in the middle of August, I might find some of them not doing terribly well, but the ones that are perhaps uh, irrigated might look fine. The next tree, I think we're all familiar with the crepe myrtles. They grow everywhere as long as it's hot and sunny. Those are the two requirements for crepe myrtle: heat and sunlight. They will not tolerate shade, but you put them in the hottest, sunniest spot in the yard and they will thrive. They are also available as a shrub. In fact, in nature, the crepe myrtle is a shrub. Where they are native in China, they are a shrub. Uh, Here in California, we train them up, torture them into a tree type shape, and you see them everywhere. And they come in whites, and pinks, and reds, and very drought tolerant. Watering them once a week in the summer is all they would ever need. And there's one, and you'll see that they have a very pretty trunk, a very smooth, pinkish trunk, and then a nice round head. Once again, a small root system, so that's why they're kind of nice as a street tree or in a narrow parkway. Seldom do the roots break the cement or the walkways. And the next tree, the Parkinsonia, the Desert Museum. Years ago, I was asked to put together a list of the top 35 trees for Santa Clarita. And that list had to be made out of trees that were drought tolerant, could take the heat, the sun, the wind. And this tree was actually number one. This was the number one tree on that list of 35 trees for use here in Santa Clarita in hot, dry areas. It's an amazing tree. It is a hybrid. Its parents were native trees, native to several different deserts. There's, as you may well know, there's more than one desert in California. Uh, there are several deserts, the Sonora and the Colorado. Uh, the Each of those deserts has its own particular variety of Palo Verde. And this one is a hybrid cross between several of them. And it does combine the best features of all of the different types of Palo Verdes. It has that deep green trunk that is so pretty, and that's how it gets its name, Palo Verde, which means green stick. It flowers much longer than any other variety of Palo Verde. And number one claim to fame, no thorns, no thorns. Very clean and very few seed pods. Once again, it can be purchased as a single trunk tree or as a multi-trunk tree. Uh, just a wonderful tree, and it just really looks great in low watering or drought tolerant landscaping. The next tree, the Arbutus unito, you see this around town a lot. The city is planting this in medians, parkways, just about everywhere. Just a wonderful tree, evergreen, available as a tree form, or once again, as a multi-trunk shrub. It does produce flowers that you see in the slide here, and a colorful little berry that is not messy. A lot of people ask me, well, isn't that berry messy? No, if you don't eat them, the birds probably will. Uh, that last line there, the fruit looks much like strawberries. That's how it got its name. They're edible, but yeah, not, not terribly delicious. And here you see some, this is actually a new haul right here. And you see some growing there on the streets in a fairly narrow parking area. And those are about full grown right there. Now, those are probably a good 20 feet high and 15 feet across. They will grow well in a lawn if the drainage is good. Um, the bark is reddish. It's very pretty bark. So it's nice to kind of trim up the lower branches to expose that bark. Okay, so that was it for our trees. And now we're going to go into our shrubs. And the first one, once again, you are probably seeing this one around town in the medians, parkways, etc. It's the Little John bottle brush, a small, compact little plant with red flowers. Takes the heat and drought, obviously. Pretty little plant. Um, a couple years back, we had a little cold snap in the middle of winter, and some of the tips of the plants burned a little bit, but they came right back. So this is just an excellent little shrub that will grow anywhere that is hot and sunny. There's one planted in a median right there. And this is kind of a nice picture. You see the plants are spaced apart, and then tree clippings are used as a mulch around them. The mulch, by the way, is not put up against the trunks of the plants, but rather outside away from the trunks. And this is a plant that will attract the hummingbirds uh, to your yard. And obviously, it'll take the heat, dryness, and smog. That's why they're using them in the parkways and the medians of the street. In heavy soils, a real heavy clay soil, uh, it'll look a little chlorotic and may need to be fed with some iron. And as I mentioned, a little frost sensitive, hasn't been an issue for a while, but like I said, a few years back, we did actually get a cold snap. Next is the lavender. This particular variety, the English lavender, is one of the prettiest, although there are dozens of wonderful, wonderful varieties. I think we're all familiar with the fragrance not only of the flower, but of the leaves. And they are a tougher plant than they look like. Uh, there you can see them growing next to a hot gravel walkway in the full sun. Don't plant them in the shade. Don't spoil these plants. Don't water them very often. I think if you watered them more than once a week, you'd probably just be wasting water. This particular grouping of plants is being watered via a drip system, and you can see it does quite well with that. They can be planted like this as a hedge or they can be planted individually. They also do well in containers. Uh, Once again, good drainage is important. A heavy clay soil should probably be amended before planting. Just a great plant. There are probably, I can think of at least 20 to 25 different varieties of lavender that are available, and they're all wonderful. Some get a little bigger, some are taller. If you wanted to plant up to 3, 4 feet tall, there would be a lavender that could get that tall. They do need to be sheared at least once a year, cut off the old flowers and let new growth come up. So next plant is actually a native. It's got a penstemon type flower, so it does attract the hummingbirds. We find this occasionally up in the foothills, uh, particularly if there happens to be an old creek bed or stream or something nearby. This particular plant can tolerate some shade. For instance, if you wanted to grow this underneath your oak tree or underneath the Palo Verde tree or the strawberry tree, it would probably be a good choice. There you can see it, and you can see that there's lots of shrubs around it, and it's sometimes called the climbing penstemon because of its propensity for arching out and laying on top of other plants. Hummingbirds love it. Now we have a juniper on our list. I know junipers are not in favor, not like they were back during my grandparents' day in the 40s and 50s. There were junipers everywhere. But this particular one is a very nice one. It's very low. It's spreading, has a beautiful shape to it and a beautiful color. Um, there you can see it uh, growing once again with mulch around it. It's excellent in rock gardens because its little tendrils will climb up over or around rocks. It'll also drape a little bit over rock walls and retaining walls. Um, no maintenance, uh, takes heat, drought, etc. Uh, and yes, of course, it's wonderful in Asian style gardens, bonsai gardens, etc. Next is the Calliandra, which is a desert native with beautiful pink flowers. Once again, the hummingbirds love it. It can also be grown as a vine. It can be trellised or trained up against a fence. Uh, this is it growing out in its native habitat, which, as you can see, is very rocky and dry. Uh, and that's where it likes. But the pink flower is quite pretty, and it is multifaceted. And next is lantana, and I think we have all seen lantana growing around town. In fact, I'm sure most of you probably have some variety of lantana in your yard. This particular one is a ground cover. It's fairly low, but can spread quite wide. Loves the sun and loves the heat. Um, it can be pruned severely and it will come back. Overwatering and fertilizer hurts this plant. I see samples of this plant constantly with black or brown spots in its leaves, and it tells me that the owner is treating that plant way too nice. There's no reason to ever fertilize it, and there's no reason to water it very frequently either. It thrives without either. Here we can see a young one just starting, and it will bloom from a very young age and bloom almost all the time, um, except when it gets very cold. Back in 2010, we had a cold snap, and these plants look like they were dead, but they all came back in the spring. So they're great on a slope, they're great as a ground cover, um, and there are many varieties, taller ones, uh, plants with white, yellow, and then there's multicolored with reds and oranges and pinks. So very pretty plant. Uh, the cotoneaster, this plant isn't used very much, but there are several varieties. This particular one is a great ground cover and great, once again, in rock gardens and on slopes. There's also a variety that grows upright and arches and is very neat and tends to attract birds. So if you like to attract birds into your yard, this would be an excellent variety to choose. This is it in the dead of winter. So uh, we show you the good side of the plants, and we show you perhaps the season of the plants when they're not looking great. And during the dead of winter, this is how this plant will look. But real tough, very tough. And as you see there, doesn't need much maintenance. Don't plant it near a walkway, though. It will want to sprawl out onto the walkway. And then you will probably have to prune it. The rock rose uh, is a great plant for slopes, hillsides, etc. It's got that pretty purple flower on it, and it blooms in the spring and summer mostly. Nice mounding shrub. There's a picture of it growing. That's a full-grown one there, and next to it you see a red sage. So once again, great in a drought-tolerant garden. Um, now that third little bullet point there, it's thought to be short-lived. Well, that is true. If you water it and feed it, it will be short-lived. Isn't that amazing? The plant actually lives longer without any fertilizer and with deep but infrequent waterings. And it does attract the butterflies. Next is the Raphiolepis. Now, Raphiolepis plants have been around for a long time. They were used in landscaping since the 50s, but this particular variety, you might find this planted also in the medians, along with the Little John bottle brush, because it stays very compact, nice green foliage, and some white to pinkish flowers in the spring. There are different varieties of it. This particular one happens to be a very compact variety. And there we see it growing out in the open. But once again, there's mulch around it. And it can tolerate regular watering, but it doesn't necessarily need it. If it does get watered too frequently, fortunately, there are water restrictions. You may not believe this, but there used to be actually people in Santa Clarita that used to water every day and sometimes even twice a day. This plant wouldn't have been a good plant for them. It would certainly have gotten fungal leaf spots and been very unhappy without much irrigation. So maybe these water restrictions that we are now facing will help to save plants like this. Now we're going to go to perennials, and a perennial is simply a plant that lives more than one season. If a plant only lived one season, it would be called an annual plant. That would be your marigolds, your pansies, your petunias, things of that nature. Perennials are flowering plants that live more than 1 year. And here's one of my favorite right here, the Salvia greggii. Uh, this one, once it starts blooming, you will have hummingbirds on it until winter time. They love this plant. It's got beautiful deep red flowers, can be grown as an individual plant or you can plant a mass of them together. Uh, the sage family of salvias, I actually had a book on them and there were over 100 species of salvia in this book. They were all wonderful. They come in different colors, different sizes, different shapes, and they all have one thing in common. They love the sun, they love the heat, they love the southwest look, they love the southwest environment, uh, and they do great. And might be one of those plants that would be excellent for growing underneath your oak tree or your palo verde tree or the strawberry tree or the crepe myrtle. There we can see a whole clump of them growing right above a retaining wall. Uh, they do grow rather quickly. They're deer resistant. Rabbits don't even seem to like the salvias or sages. I should also mention they don't seem to like the lavenders or the rosemaries. So those three plants, they're all three very durable, all three very pretty, and they don't have too many problems. Next is a Gaillardia. This is a plant that comes from the Great Plains. You see these growing native in Colorado, for instance. The butterflies like them, and they come in reds, oranges, and yellows. Tough plant, loves the sun, and there you see a mass of them. Very pretty. And you can space them out 12 to 18 inches apart. And you can grow them from seed and they can also reseed. Uh, if the plant dies back in the winter, uh, new ones can come up in the spring. Next is the yarrow. This is the common yarrow, but once again, there's many varieties of it. Some, some varieties of yarrow are even used as a lawn substitute. Some varieties can even be mowed. Um, love the sun, love the heat, prefer good drainage, having many different colors. Uh, Probably not the plant for a formal garden. If you like everything neat and clean and you like to water and feed things, this wouldn't be the plant for you. Uh, this plant does excellent out in the open, full sun, and I used to water mine once a week and it seemed to do just fine with that. Does attract the butterflies and it does spread a bit. That's why I don't think that you would want it in a well manicured formal garden. Probably better off on a slope or a drought tolerant garden. Now here's penstemon. Penstemons are a beautiful plant. This particular one is a native, but there's a number of hybrids that are quite pretty. And the hummingbirds, once again, just love them. Uh, they are perennial, meaning you'll have them for several years. Uh, in the spring, the nurseries will have dozens of varieties of these, all different colors, all of them quite beautiful. This one, the native, you'll see it quite often if you hike in the local mountains. If you go up to any of the hiking areas that surround our valley here, you'll quite often see these, particularly after a wet spring. You'll see them blooming. Here's one growing by itself. Uh, this might even be up at the one of the botanical gardens. And you can see some lavenders growing with them and sages. Excellent, excellent plant. Uh, so there is the native variety, and then there are what they call the hybrid varieties that are very pretty. And the hybrid varieties I've even seen do well in containers. Okay, next is a, this is not your grandmother's geranium. This is a true geranium. The plant that a lot of us call geranium is actually pelargonium. These plants are excellent as ground covers. They're excellent in containers. They're excellent massed in rock gardens, etc. Uh, very pretty. And there are several varieties of these true geraniums. Okay? There you see it growing next to a walkway, and you see they have kind of a sprawling habit. So they do work well in containers, hanging baskets, and as a ground cover. Lamb's ear. Lamb's ear is a pretty plant. I think most of you have seen that. Its claim to fame is that the beautiful gray foliage helps to break up all the greenery in the yard. Uh, it does spread a bit, uh, and it will tolerate a little bit of shade. Uh, Grows in most soils because it's not terribly deep rooted. Does need room to spread a bit, and there you can see it used very nicely around some rocks. It does have a flower, a purplish flower that will attract butterflies, and needs an occasional shearing, but it is a great contrast to all of the green in the garden. Now, this plant is a beautiful plant. Uh, there are varieties that are native to the Catalina Islands. What makes this plant different than any other plant that we've talked about so far is that this plant, you could put this in your shady areas. None of the other plants we've talked about want to be in the shade. This plant can grow in the shade. It can grow in containers. Uh, it, it can be massed underneath evergreen trees. It can take a little morning sun, and it comes in a dozen varieties. This particular variety, you'll see, has a very light purple underneath and a dark purple on top. And its foliage is really its claim to fame. However, it does produce a flower, thus the name coral bells. And the flower spikes stick up about a foot above the plant, and they're nice, but I think it's the foliage that is so attractive. And it will come in a bright green foliage the size of a quarter to a bright red foliage 5 inches across. So many different varieties and great as an understory. What that means is planted under trees where it can take advantage of the shade that the tree provides. Daylilies. I think everybody's familiar with these. There are many hybrids. They come in yellows, oranges, and reds. And they're a clump, and the clump gets a little bit bigger every year, tend to bloom mostly in the hot months. Uh, Summer is the best time for these guys, and there you can see one blooming. They're wonderful in parkways. Uh, they'll even grow in containers, and after a couple of years, you can dig them up, separate them, and make many new plants from them. And then the rosmarinus, rosemary. This was one of the three plants that I told you that seem to be resistant to most problems. And this with the sages and the lavenders make a wonderful combination. There are, once again, a dozen varieties of rosemary, including this variety, which is the prostrate, which is a ground cover, which grows very low and makes an excellent ground cover on hot, dry hillsides. Its flowers attract the honeybees, which are great for pollination. People with fruit trees should plant a few lavenders in the yard to attract the bees, the honeybees, to the yard to pollinize the fruits. Also, same thing in a vegetable garden. Not bad to have a rosemary or two growing outside the vegetable garden. There you can see a ground cover variety, and it'll get quite wide, and some varieties don't get very tall. There's also a variety that does get tall. Um, I grew a variety that got 4 feet tall and 4 feet high. It can be used for culinary purposes. I used to take a sprig of it and put it in the new bottle of olive oil. Uh, Also, excellent in baked potatoes. You take your baked potato before you cook it, cut it in half, put in a sprig of rosemary and perhaps a sprig of sage, and then wrap it up and bake it. And the flavor will permeate the baked potato. And then the Russian sage, not a true sage at all, but it is perennial. It is easy to grow, has a grayish green foliage like this right here, and these spikes of red flowers that come up. Can take sun heat, reflected heat. Uh, it's fire wise, meaning it won't burn. Does tend to die back in the winter, but then comes right back up. Uh, this particular area that you're seeing it in is probably excellent. It's kind of bordered on every side. That would probably keep it from coming up where you don't want it. And next, we had to throw a succulent in there. And this particular one, the sedum tabile, is quite spectacular with its pink flowers that rise a foot up and put these clusters of pink flowers up above the foliage. I see these a lot in some of the new developments that are going up around Santa Clarita. Uh, all of the new developments in Santa Clarita have drought tolerant landscaping. They don't have lawns, and the use of succulents and sedums uh, helps to keep the yards colorful. And there you see it growing amidst a bunch of other plants, including some um, grasses. Okay. And yes, the hummingbirds and butterflies love it. Okay. Next is another plant from the Great Plains, like the Gaillardia, the Coreopsis, will grow in the heat and the sun. Uh, Many different varieties, most of them small shrubs, a foot high, a foot to a foot and a half across. Loves it hot, loves it dry, and it's just a beautiful plant, and it blooms for a very long period of time. You can see it looks quite nice there when there's a whole mass of them together. That's the Coreopsis. Now we're going to talk about a few ground covers. Some of the plants we've already talked about would work as ground covers. The rosemary and the lantana, for instance, are two that come to mind. Here's the blue fescue, kind of a nice grass with a bluish gray tint, which is nice once again to break up all the greenery in the yard. They do flower, but you don't grow it for that. You grow it for its foliage. It likes to be out in the open, doesn't want to stay too wet. Uh, and there we can see it in a mass, grown among other plants. So very pretty because of its color and texture. And it is a great border plant, ground cover, or turf substitute, and can be used in large containers and avoid overwatering. And I think the water district is making sure we don't do that. And Diamondia, this has become quite popular as a ground cover. When it first came out, when people were first planting it, they were having difficulty with it. And it turned out that in almost every occasion where they were having difficulty planting this plant or growing this plant, they were watering it too much. The plant is much more durable than it appears. It looks fragile, but it is just strong and thrives in dry areas and areas of irregular irrigation. And it does get a yellow flower on it. But it's a great turf substitute for hot areas, reflected heat, does well between stepping stones. Plant the individual plants a foot apart and they will spread. Myoporum. This one is used a lot here in Santa Clarita. If watered deeply to get it established, it will put down nice roots and grow rather quickly. People have had a little bit of difficulty establishing this plant with shallow, frequent waterings. So the answer would be deep, thorough waterings to get it established. Once it's established, it can just take regular watering. And there we see it as a turf substitute or a ground cover. Okay. Does suffer from overwatering. If it has good drainage, that won't be an issue. Water it deeply, but infrequently, and I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. I will now take questions from the audience. Okay, and our first question is, will this presentation be recorded? Yes, this and all of our classes are recorded. You can actually go back and watch classes from years ago. If there's a particular subject you want to brush up on, yes. Okay. Is there a small magnolia that is suitable for our climate? Preference is for evergreen with saucer type flowers. Some are growing alongside Center Point Parkway, opposite the entrance to Parks and Recreation. Okay, so the answer to that is yes, there are two small magnolias that do well here. The St. Mary gets perhaps 25 feet tall, and the Little Gem is a nice short, maybe 12, 15 feet tall. And once again, it has that beautiful foliage of the magnolias. So the St. Mary and the Little Gem are two that do quite well. The varieties that they call saucer magnolias are deciduous. They drop their leaves. And they're pretty when they're blooming, and they just look like a green plant after that. Okay. Next question. Do you prefer to plant lavender plants or grow them from seed? I have seeds, but I'm not sure. Also, if I plant the seeds in the ground or grow them in small pots first. Well, certainly put them in the ground wherever you want them. Plant the seeds where you want the plants to grow. I don't start plants in containers and then move them out. I plant them where I want them. If you do buy a plant, buy the smallest plant you can find. Lavenders are perennial plants. They're really best the first 3 years. After 3, 4, 5 years, they start to get a bit woody. So I would not buy a big lavender plant. I would buy a small lavender plant. Maybe replace it after 3 or 4 years with another small plant. Next question. How do bougainvilleas do here in Santa Clarita? They do wonderfully in hot, dry areas. They do not like to be watered very frequently. You'll find that some of the best looking bougainvilleas around are ones that are in full sun with lots of heat and very little care. The only thing I have to warn you about bougainvilleas is when you buy them, they have a root system that is very sensitive. So it's best to leave them in the pots, just cut the sides of the pots and put the pot in the ground in a hot, sunny area. You can water it and fertilize it for the first year to get it up to size, and then you can pretty much ignore it. Next question. We have a lot of rabbits that come into our yard. And I think that most of the ground covers and perennials that we've talked about probably are somewhat resistant to the rabbits. I know that I mentioned the lavender, the rosemary, and the sages as being good varieties that I don't think the rabbits care that much for. Now, if you wanted to feed rabbits, you could grow gazanias. I think they like those a lot. Okay, next. How do you dig out overgrown agaves? Well, very carefully. Um, most people will use a sharpened shovel or spade that is very sharp and begin cutting, starting at the bottom, and take the individual leaves off of the plant one at a time, going around the plant slowly but surely. Okay? Next, we have ground squirrels that eat our growing seeds. We're going to fall garden, worry about our crops. What do we do about ground squirrels? Well, it is legal. It is perfectly legal in California to eradicate ground squirrels by any means. I'll leave it at that. Okay, next. I have 2 baby blueberry plants and the instructions say full sun. Well, they might take the full sun up in Washington State or up in Michigan or Alaska, not in Santa Clarita. They will die in the full sun. Blueberries do best here with morning sun, nothing past probably 1 o'clock. Okay? So if you have an area of the yard, maybe an east or east by north side, that would probably be a great place to grow your blueberries. Next question, does the desert willow do well in the SCV? Absolutely it does. I have a huge one in front of my yard right now that is blooming like crazy, and there's probably a dozen hummingbirds on it at this moment as we speak. So yes, they thrive. I might mention that my desert willow is not connected to any form of irrigation system, and it does wonderfully. Our pomegranate had lots of flowers, and we saw baby fruits, but then nothing grew. Well, one of 2 things happened. You either fed the plant while it had fruit on it, which it does not like, or you watered it too frequently, which it does not like. If you're going to feed a pomegranate, you'll do it early in the season, early in spring, before the plant flowers. If you're going to water it early in the spring. Don't water it when it just has fruit. If you do water it when it has fruit, only once a week. Okay? Which of the trees presented would be fast growing? I think the first one that we talked about, the Chinese pistache, would be great. And it grows rather quickly. And I don't think that any of the trees we talked about had invasive roots, so I don't think that should be an issue for you. Okay, next question. We have a Philippine lime plant. It's doing well, but the leaves are yellowing. What do we do? Typically, yellowing comes from excessive moisture. That can be caused by watering too frequently or from having a heavy soil. I have found that most citrus plants do wonderfully with once a week watering in the summer when it's hot over 95 degrees, and about once every 2 weeks the rest of the year. Certainly you can feed them with minerals like iron and zinc and magnesium, and that will certainly help the plants. The next question is about star jasmine. Is it a good ground cover, and do they take lots of water? I would say they are a good ground cover. I would say average watering. If you were to water according to the guidelines as prescribed by the water district that we discussed before class began, it would do fine. It would do fine. Okay. Another question about the pomegranates. Okay, pomegranates are tough. They are stronger than most people think. They will thrive on neglect. I water mine once a week very thoroughly. I don't feed mine, but if you wanted to fertilize it, only do it early in the spring. Do not feed it when there is fruit on the plant. And don't be tempted to water it excessively when there is fruit on the plant. Quite often, feeding and watering heavily when there is fruit or flowers on a fruiting plant will cause the plant to grow into a growth stage and drop its fruits and flowers. Okay? Next, what do I recommend to eradicate ground squirrels? Well, I use every means at my disposal. There are bait blocks available. There are traps that you can catch the squirrels alive and relocate them. And I do that. I think I've relocated 4 of them this summer that were going after my fruit trees. I'm a pretty nice guy, but I don't like to share my fruit with the ground squirrels. So yes, I trap them and I remove them to a wilderness area. Next, how often should I water my dwarf lime and living growing in containers? Well, containers are a little more difficult. Containers do need to be watered more frequently than plants that are in the ground. My plants are all in the ground, and I found that once a week is fine. I would think that in a container, they would probably need at least twice a week during this hot weather. And once again, I should mention that watering fruit trees and watering container plants are not covered by the guidelines of the water agency. So you can water your fruiting plants in containers as needed, whenever they need it. I can pretty much assure you if you water them every day, they will do poorly, possibly even die. Okay. Next question. My peppermint grew a flower. Does that mean it's done? Well, hopefully your peppermint is in a container and not in the ground. Mint, all types of mint, are invasive weeds. And the flowering does not mean it's done. No, unlike a basil or a cilantro plant or a brassica plant, flowering does not mean it's the end of the life cycle for that particular plant. They have underground stolons that allow the plant to spread and come back even after adverse conditions like heat, frost, etc. Okay. What causes the edges of my rose bush to turn brown? Quite often, a shallow, frequent watering deposits salt in the soil and the plant brings it up. It's not going to kill your plant, not harmful, but the answer to how to avoid it would be watering deeply and less frequently. Now, I water my roses once a week and they thrive. Some people have told me that they need to water their plants more often than that to keep them looking good. If that's true in your location, then fine. Water them twice a week if you have to. Just make sure it's a deep, thorough watering. This will keep the salts soluble and move them through the root zone. Okay. I want to plant herbs like garlic, onions, and ginger. I don't know where to start. Could you please advise? Well, you can start garlic and onions from little bulbets. You can start ginger from pieces of the root. So that's where you would start with. You can actually even go to the store or to the nursery, not at this time of year, but soon, perhaps in fall, and buy organic garlic cloves and onion sets and ginger root and take them home and plant them. They grow easily. What are good vegetables to grow in this zone for fall season? Well, there's a lot of them. I don't think I'm going to list them all, but typically the fall plants are the vegetative types, ones that don't have fruit. So this would be your lettuces, your kale, spinach, cauliflower, broccoli, things of that sort. I had a baby pine tree, but it died. It was in full sun. Can they grow in Santa Clarita? I would say take a look outside your window. If you can't see a pine tree when you look out your window, look out another window. You'll find one. There are, well, I don't want to say millions, but certainly tens of thousands of pine trees in Santa Clarita. I'm sorry your baby pine died, but didn't have to do with the fact that it was in Santa Clarita. Last question. Do you plant herbs in pots or planter beds? That is completely up to you. Most people would put garlic, onions, and ginger in the ground to give them plenty of room that they need for their root system. Okay, I think we got them all. I think we got all of the questions that were being asked. Oh, well, hold on. Got one more here. We planted a fig tree and it lost all its leaves and did nothing. Wow. So they planted a fig tree in the ground and it lost all its leaves. Chances are it went into shock. The root system probably got damaged during the planting phase. Certainly figs grow in the ground. Very few, well, every fig I've ever seen has been in the ground, other than starter plants that were in the plastic pots. A fig tree has a huge root system, so growing it in a container might be okay for a few short years. But once again, it has a big root zone, so plant it where it has lots of room to grow all the way around it, in the sun and in the heat. And as I've been saying all along, don't water too frequently. My papaya tree leaves keep falling off. What do you recommend? Well, a papaya is a tropical plant. We don't live in a tropical garden. I don't know anybody in Santa Clarita that is having any success growing papayas. So I don't think I can help you with that question. I can help you with plants that do well here and can grow here. I just can't help you with the papaya. Sorry. My aloe vera plant is brown. It's not under full sun. Any advice on how to care for aloe vera? Yeah, it doesn't like full sun. Aloe vera does well in containers. It also does well in the ground, but only with morning sun. It's turned brown, and it's not sunburn. Perhaps it's getting too wet. That's the only thing I know. Okay, so it is easy to grow. Yes. We have silver carpet as a ground cover, but it gets very dry looking and seems to die in the summer. It is supposed to be drought tolerant. I believe it is. Have you tried watering it once a week? Why don't you do that? Try watering it once a week, see if it perks up at all. That's the best advice I can give you on that particular plant. Okay. There is a nursery in the valley that grows papaya trees. Yes, I know that. That's the San Fernando Valley. Yes, there is a tree called papaya tree nursery in the San Fernando Valley in Granada Hills that grows papayas. I don't think that the weather in the San Fernando Valley is, or the climate or the growing conditions are exactly the same here in Santa Clarita. Okay. Any advice on how to increase hummingbirds and bees? Yes, watch this program. If you missed part of it, go back and watch it again. Most of the plants we talked about will help you to get more hummingbirds and bees into your garden. Okay. Laura, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, John.
Okay, do you see anything else that we need to answer?
There's one more question. It says, are fire sticks poisonous to hummingbirds?
No, I'm not aware of any plant that's poisonous to hummingbirds. So hummingbirds know what to eat and what not to eat. If there were plants that were poisonous to them, I don't think we'd have any hummingbirds left. So I don't worry about planting fire sticks. They do just fine out here.
All right, well, that seems like that is it. Thank you, John. We appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, and I will see you at the next show.
Okay.
All righty,
Have a good
folks.
one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.